Folks, I think I will just start with who we have here, and maybe the recording will be successful and be on YouTube or something. But I guess I'll just go ahead with who we have here. Okay. So first, let me say that I think one thing that hopefully we can all agree on before we get into debate is that the Russian invasion was unjustified and is a war of aggression. And a context for this, of course, is U.S. imperialism and NATO's expansion. But given that, I think there's a lot of debate over what's primary and how to approach the question, how to talk about it. So I'm going to raise four major points, 4 points that I feel that there's been differences on, and speak to those. And I think the first place we need to start is with the socialist principle of independence and self-determination. That, to me, is the primary political point, the primary principle that we need to be talking about as the left. Everything else, including NATO and U.S. imperialism, is secondary, and a secondary aspect of what's going on. The primary aspect is the Russian invasion, and the primary position for the left to take is independence and self-determination. So the first point that I've come across from many people on the left is that NATO expansion threatens Russia and has pushed Putin to invade, and we in the U.S. are really only obliged to focus on U.S. imperialism. And I think if people watched Bill Fletcher and Chomsky interview from last week, I think Chomsky was a perfect example of this. He started off with about a 2 or 3 minute condemnation of Russia, and then the rest of his talk was on NATO and U.S. imperialism. And I've read a lot of articles that do the same thing. First paragraph is on Russia, it's bad, and then everything goes to NATO and the U.S., and there seems to be a refusal to really confront Russian imperialism. So even on the question of NATO, I even question if that is the key thing for Russia. So let me just quote Vladimir Putin here, who on the eve of the invasion said this: Ukraine has no national rights that Russians are bound to respect. Prepare for reunification with Mother Russia. This is Lenin's Ukraine. He was the author and the architect. Obviously, great Russian chauvinism, no mention of NATO, and the main desire to reincorporate the Ukraine into the Russian fold. There's been a lot of talk about Russian security concerns by folks who take this position. But there's been almost no talk about Ukrainian security concerns. I find that amazing. And security concerns of Estonia and Latvia and Poland and Moldavia. After all, on the Ukrainian border is the second largest army in the world and a nuclear power. So if you want to talk about Russian security concerns, why aren't we talking about Ukrainian security concerns? That seems to be a smaller state and a weaker state and a more threatened state. People talk about a lot how the U.S. promised Russia that there would be no NATO expansion eastward. And you hear that a lot, and that was a verbal sort of agreement. It was never a treaty, never written down. But there was a treaty that people seem to forget and not talk about, that the U.S. signed, that Russia signed, and Ukraine signed. That was that Ukraine would give up their nuclear weapons, and Russia promised never to invade. And Ukraine at the time was the third largest nuclear power in the world. So what about that treaty, which was an actual written obligation on the part of the Russians that they now have broken? By the way, it's an interesting fact that Russia has bought between $400 to $500 million of weapons from NATO countries in the last 5 years. So NATO states and Belgium and France and the German, Italian arms industry has, all NATO countries have been selling millions of dollars worth of arms to Russia up to 2020. So how great a threat is NATO, according to this? I think the problem here for many people who take this position is that they fall into this trap of realist foreign policy of George Kennan and Kissinger and Scowcroft or others. When we start talking about the security concerns of great powers, and great powers, their security extends to the countries on their border and to the countries that are nearby, we fall into this trap of imperialist ideology. We don't accept that when we talk about U.S. Threats to Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua. Then we refuse this type of logic. But yet now many on the left are repeating it to sort of justify Russia's concern about what's happening on their border. You have a lot of, well, the U.S. does this and the U.S. does that. Well, yeah, if you compare everything to what the U.S. does, you can justify any criminal act possible, right? The thing is that we have to concentrate, the main thing that's happening here is a Russian invasion, not a NATO invasion. So that's where we should really focus our attention. Lastly, on this point about, the left is obligated only to focus on U.S. imperialism. When did that become an anti-imperialist position, that we ignore all other imperialisms in the world? We condemn Zionism in Israel for their attacks on the Palestinian people. We condemn South African apartheid. Many of us condemn human rights violations in China. So when has the so-called idea that we're only obligated to oppose U.S. imperialism become something that we're supposed to follow? It's ridiculous. Number two, there are Nazis in the Ukraine, so Putin is fighting a fascist threat. Yes, there are Nazis in the Ukraine. They have, as we know, they have militarized units, they have various political organizations, and they can mobilize street protests and some heat. But I think their influence has been greatly overemphasized, and what's ignored is the neo-fascist movement in Russia and the neo-fascist participation in the Donbass. So let's investigate this a little bit. There's a lot of talk about the Azov Brigade. They have 1,000 fighters. Let's remember that the Ukrainian army has 190,000 troops. So the Azov Brigade is 1,000 out of 190,000. Also, the Ukrainian people have mobilized 900,000 volunteer forces as territorial defense, including the resistance committees, which are composed of socialists and anarchists and left Ukrainians. When it comes to the political support for the far right and the fascists in Ukraine, it's almost nothing. All the five major far right parties united behind a presidential candidate in 2018, they got 1.5% of the vote. The next year elections for parliament, the far right and the neo-fascists got 2.6% of the national vote. They didn't even get one parliamentary seat. Then there were regional elections in the next year, and they managed to capture about 3.5% of the regional posts, like mayors and city councilmen. So when we compare that to the 42% that Le Pen just got in France and the 73 million supporters of Donald Trump and the far-right party in Germany and Netherlands, the political support for the fascists and the far-right in the Ukraine is far less than other European countries. So we should recognize that. Now, let's look at Putin and Russia. Putin is an iconic hero for the neo-fascists throughout Europe and the United States. He's supported in Russia by the ultra-right white Christian Orthodox supremacists, and these are various fascist organizations inside of Russia that support Putin. The Russian Eastern Orthodox Church, well, it's not a fascist organization, but like the evangelical movement here in the United States that supports Trump, they support Putin. There's the Motherland Party, the Russian Imperial Movement, the Wagner paramilitary group, which is like Blackwater, and importantly, the ideologue Alexander Dugin, who's a ultra far-right nationalist. Every member of the General Staff Academy has assigned his books to read, and he has been a major advisor to the head of foreign intelligence in Russia. In terms of the Donbass region, these are a list of the fascist, ultranationalist, neo-Nazi groups who have been involved in Donbass. There's the Wagner Group. I probably mispronounced some of these names. Pamyat, the Russian National Unity Party, the Russian Orthodox Army, Wolves 100, Russian Imperial Movement, Ruskaya Orraz, Interbrigades, the Syrozhich, Rushkich, and Ratibort battalions. I probably just bastardized their names. Sparta Battalion, Euro-Asian Youth, the Slavic Union, and Movement Against Illegal Immigration. Those are all neo-fascist groups mobilized and active in the Donbass. In terms of international fascist volunteers, well, we know there's been some volunteers going to the Ukrainian side, but here's what's going on in the Donbass. The Phalange from Poland, Orthodox Dawn from Bulgaria, Legion of St. Stephen from Hungary, the Civic Detachment from Serbia, Millennium from Italy, and Unite Continental from France. Those are all fascist volunteers presently active in the Donbass. So if we're going to talk about fascists in the Ukraine, let's talk about fascists in Russia and fascists in the Donbass, and not just the forces in the Ukraine. Number 3, we should demand that the U.S. stop sending military aid to end the fighting. Well, I believe in the right to self-defense, and the Ukrainians have the right to defend their independence and arm themselves. I find it amazing that the left takes a position that the Ukraine has no right to defend, shouldn't accept, or we should call for a halt to the arming of the Ukrainians. This would be like during the Vietnam War, if the left said Russia and China should stop arming the Vietnamese because the more arms the Vietnamese get, the fighting will just continue and more Vietnamese will die, and the best way of getting out of the war is to stop arming the Vietnamese, and then the U.S. imperialists will seek a peace treaty with the Vietnamese. Absurd. The only way the Russians will come to the peace table are one of two ways: an outright victory of Russia so they can dictate terms, or the cost of the invasion will become unacceptable as the cost of Vietnam became unacceptable to the U.S. For the Ukrainians, for the Ukrainians to not defend themselves as a way to get peace in this war is to me, it's just makes no sense. I just a week or two ago, Code Pink made a reply to the Ukrainian foreign minister. The Ukrainian foreign minister was being interviewed, and he said, "We need weapons, weapons, weapons." And Code Pink came on and said, "No, they should call for a ceasefire, 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 negotiate, negotiate, negotiate." Well, tell it to Putin. Don't tell it to the Ukrainians. Zelensky has been asking to meet with Putin from the very beginning of the war. The Russians are the ones who won't seriously negotiate. Don't demand the surrender of the Ukrainians. What we should be saying is what we said during the Vietnam War. Out now. Russia, out now. Don't tell the Ukrainians to surrender and not to fight. Lastly, this is a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia, and Ukraine is essentially a puppet that's controlled by the U.S. and NATO. Well, this totally ignores agency. This idea of U.S. hegemony is everything and everybody's a puppet of the U.S. That was essentially what Chomsky's position was, by the way. The Ukrainians have agency. People in Poland, people in Latvia, people in Estonia, they all have agency themselves. We have to ask ourselves, why do these states want to join NATO? Or why do these states want to move closer to the EU? Well, what was their experience with Russia? That's what we need to ask here. The Ukrainians have their own agency. They're not fighting for U.S. imperialism. They're not fighting for NATO. They're fighting for their own national independence, and they have massively mobilized over 1 million troops to defend their country. So respect the agency of the Ukrainian people themselves. The other thing around this is that much of the left in the EU and in the U.S. don't give voice to Eastern European socialists and leftists, and don't give voice to the Russian left. If you pay attention to what the social movement in Ukraine is saying and what Russian leftists are saying, and other leftists from the former Soviet Union, they're all pretty much in support of the independence of Ukraine and see Putin's government as a authoritarian state that's moving towards fascism. This is a multicentric world. It's a world with deep economic ties and integration, and those deep economic ties impact and complement this rather simplistic binary understanding of the conflict. Lastly, there are a lot of opportunities here on the other side of the argument, talk about refugees and U.S. hypocrisy. We talk a lot to ourselves, unfortunately. So I think if you have friends at work or in your family or at your church or wherever, once you make known that you support the Ukrainian people and support their independence, then there's good opportunities to talk about the racist hypocrisy around the refugee crisis. There are good opportunities to talk about U.S. hypocrisy and human rights violations and war crimes that the U.S. have committed in all the wars that the U.S. has been involved in. And I would like to mention here the New York Times, because very interestingly, just a few months ago in December, the New York Times ran some very deeply researched articles about U.S. crimes, U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. The first one was, probably everyone here remembers, the killing of the family and 7 children during the withdrawal from Afghanistan when we bombed this house. The Pentagon came on TV, the head of the defense, and said, no, this was an ISIS, we killed ISIS terrorists. New York Times did a deep investigation, exposed the whole thing, and forced the Pentagon to come up and admit that we killed this family and 7 children. They then did a deep dive into the special operation units that's been over the drone bombings in Syria and exposed this killing of 70 women and children on the banks of the river next to Mosul. And they just recently, last week, ran a very in-depth article about this officer who was a drone pilot who committed suicide. And the whole article went into how every month civilians are killed by drones and the Pentagon is ignoring it. And then they reran all these articles on the front page last week. So they didn't compare these things in any of the articles and said, look, therefore Biden is a damn hypocrite when he talks about Russian war crimes or so-called genocide. But it doesn't take much thought for any reader of those articles to understand what the Russians are doing, the U.S. has done. So there's not a total blackout by the U.S. media about U.S. war crimes. They're also being talked about, and that offers a good opportunity for the left to talk about this also, but only after we make clear that the primary concern here is at this moment in time, in this moment in history, is the U.S. invasion of the Ukraine, and that this war is an unjust war of aggression, and that we call for the immediate withdrawal of Russia from the Ukraine and the arming and the self-defense of the Ukrainian people. When that becomes our main focus, then we could talk about these other issues of the refugees and U.S. hypocrisy and U.S. crimes abroad. So those are the 4 points I wanted to make. I think they're the sort of the 4 points of major differences that I've been seeing in the approach to the war on between U.S. and also European leftists. And I'll throw it open here to people with different points of views and other comments. Norma, I see you talking, but I can't hear you.
You're muted, Norma. You have to use *6.
Oh,
People could put comments and questions into the chat. You could type there, and we could, discuss them through the chat, and I'll be happy to respond to people in the chat if you want to type in questions if you're having difficulty with the phone.
Jerry, can you hear me, Lauren here?
I can hear you, Lauren, yes.
Okay. I know that we talked about this, but just, one of the things that, and it's not relevant to the argument because, obviously you and I have been agreeing on these things for 30, 40, 100 years, something like that. But one of the things that just came out and I read, got to consider the source was the Ukrainian, that the Russians are really getting their ass kicked badly. I mean, we're not talking about losing a battalion or so. And from what some of the military analysts are saying, that the very structure of the Russian military, which is very authoritarian, top-down thing, is such that they're going to have the same problems in Donbass that they had in Kiev of low morale, and that they're having to get out old, 30, 40-year-old equipment from the Soviet era, most of which doesn't work or it's rusted out. And the United States may very well, for a change, be doing the right thing by arming them. And we've seen the effectiveness of the American Stinkers, the British Outlaws, moving in the A-300 anti-aircraft missiles, etc. And so the big question comes up, and I don't have the answer to this, but it might be worth your comments or anybody else. Will Putin go nuclear? And according to a lot of people, if he were to go nuclear, the fallout would kill a lot more Russians than it would Ukrainians. Do you have any comments on either of those points?
Well, as obviously the Russian military is having a lot of difficulty. How much difficulty? A lot of reports are coming from the Ukrainian side. So we don't, it's hard to know what to believe in terms of the measure of actual casualties. Because I think both sides will probably, say they're having greater success than they are. But it is obvious for everybody to see in the world that Russia is having a difficult time. Will he go nuclear? I think not, but it's hard to say absolutely no. But I think going nuclear has such ramifications that Putin and the Russian government are quite aware of the ramifications of that, and that may be a bridge too far.
I had to go outside because some guys turned up wanting to chop down some of my trees. So I missed a lot, and I'm sorry about that. But I just wanted to say that I appreciate your introductory remarks because as much as Russia has been invaded by Europe over and over again, so has Poland been invaded by Russia over and over again. And those who argue that we ought not to have let countries into NATO that wanted to be let in, as if they have no right of self-determination, but we are actually deciding everything, it strikes me as a weird illusion of reality. What about the sovereignty of Latvia, which we did not force to join? So I appreciate your saying. I haven't heard anybody except me say this so far. Secondly, it's my belief, as far as I can tell, that the Budapest Memorandum is just that, a memorandum. It's not a treaty. Were it a treaty, Ukraine could be suing the U.S. and the UK in U.S. and UK courts for breaking the treaty. That's how treaties, international treaties, are enforced, bizarrely enough. So, I fear that agreement that we made, the assurance, it's called an assurance, the assurance that we gave Ukraine that we would defend it if it was invaded, is just that. It's an assurance with no treaty obligations because the people who arranged it didn't think they could get it through Congress.
Thank you for that correction on the memorandum. I'm making a note right now on it. Thank you for that.
Can you hear me yet? Not yet. You can? I was reading that note that tells us that Cliff probably pressed the wrong button, or Cliff or somebody, whoever connects, and maybe we could all disconnect and let Cliff reconnect and let us join. No, he's saying no. Okay. That would facilitate the exchange. Thank you.
I have a comment on the nuclear question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. I tend to agree with Jerry when I think as a whole, the Russians would not want to engage in a nuclear confrontation. But the thing that worries me is they get themselves in this situation where they like in that port city with everybody holed up in that steel mill and they keep plugging away at it. And I'm worried about some general saying, well, this is a perfect target for a tactical nuke. And tactical nukes aren't all that bad. So maybe we could just use a tactical nuke and take these guys out. That's the kind of thinking that worries me, that somebody, because I think tactical or strategic, anytime a nuke gets used, all bets are off. And we're not in Kansas anymore. So that's just one caveat. Otherwise, I generally agree with what you said, Jerry.
Yeah, I think tactical nuclear weapons are about as big as the ones that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that's what's considered tactical today. So that would probably wipe out pretty much everybody in Mariupol. There is a fear there, obviously. One of the things I've been thinking is that they don't want to destroy the steelworks because they want to take it over. It's an asset. So they don't want total leveling of the steelworks. It's, obviously a very large steel work. I mean, I worked in a steel mill, and I see 3 or 4 blast furnaces there, and that's as big as U.S. Steel in Chicago or Inland Steel. So this is a major asset, and they may not, hopefully, want to destroy it as well as all the people on the inside. I think just one problem that's going on in the war, the Azov Brigade, when we talk about fascists, of course, one of their strongholds has been in Mariupol. And, well, I think the problem coming out of this is that, it enhances their reputation. For all the talk about the denazification of Russia, the Azov Battalion will come out of this as great patriots and the heroes, sacrificing heroes. So the post-war situation, or as it develops, I think it's a whole new ballgame in the Ukraine. It's also interesting that leftists from the social movements are also talking about possibilities for a broader and more active left in the Ukraine, coming out against the neoliberals and neoliberal globalist oligarchs that have ruled the Ukraine itself, and stepping up working class struggles, because that the working class is sacrificing as a whole and coming together. And as we know, coming out of World War II, like in Great Britain, the great sacrifice of the working class in the Great Britain caused the government to establish the national healthcare system after World War II. So to the left and to the right, a lot of the Ukraine situation is becoming, I think, very open in terms of this political situation.
I have an additional comment on the nuke issue, twofold. One, I would gather that I'm probably the only person, at least on this group, that actually was trained as a psychologist back in an earlier life. I don't think Putin is crazy. I think he's a narcissistic, authoritarian son of a bitch, but I don't think he's crazy. I really thought that he just did not, he really thought, following George Bush, that the Ukrainians were going to throw flowers in front of the tanks. I think he's a very, he's not going to get to the kind of position that he got into in the KGB, now FSB, by being a crazy lunatic. I just think he's very misinformed and has a cultural notion of wanting to restore Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, vast imperial Russia. The other thing is, I'm sort of a simple sociologist, not a meteorologist, but from everything I gathered from looking at the maps, the winds in that area generally blow from east to west. That means that any nuke set off in Ukraine, most of the fallout is going to come into Russia. And some of the people that know a lot more than I do can estimate that, between 500,000 and 1 million people are going to have radiation levels higher than they would like. Namely, they're going to die.
One thing I'm wondering is, until Trump, I believe we were not adding to our nuclear arsenal. And then Trump was like, well, no, we need more. And that started off a whole thing where now Russia was saying, oh, we need more, and a whole proliferation thing, to the best of my recollection, because Biden dialed that back.
Oh, I think he's carried it forward, as a matter of
fact. Both the Russians and the Americans have started building new nuclear weapons and escalating by a couple of thousand. The Chinese have, in response, they've always had a very small number, but now they're moving up to about 1,000.
Well, this is relevant to all of our security. This is crazy. So I'd recommend that we contact our representatives and say, end this crazy Trump policy. It's why hasn't Biden done that?
Because Biden is still a Cold War warrior, even if he's gotten a little bit warmer than he used to be. And I mean, I know it's not the topic for today, but the American government is basically bought, sold by a number of large corporations. Most of us know this, beginning with the fact that a big military, and, Jerry just mentioned something about, spending, but, the defense contractors, Raytheon, Lockheed, they've been, their stocks have been zooming up. and they've been making a fortune off of this. And they have lobbyists, 2 or 3 lobbyists for every single representative in the Congress. And I mean, for those of us, I mean, I stopped being a Democrat in 1968 when I was tear gassed in front of the Hilton. The Democrats are very, very split. There's the good people, the Bernista people, but you know, they don't really have much power. And then you have the mainstream Democrats, you know, Schumer, and I mean, he must be a nice enough person and all that. Pelosi, they're not about to cut military spending. Biden has upped it, and that is one of the great problems. I'm not saying that's the cause of America's policy in Ukraine, but they are profiting big time off of that. You know, there's a sad fact. I don't think too many people here are going to cry, but we have depleted our Stinger supply, and we're really going to be running short of Stingers pretty soon because we've sent so many of them off to the Ukrainians. And I don't know how many tanks. They claim they've knocked out 800 tanks. Whether it's true or not, I have no idea, as Jerry pointed out. But they've been very effective, as well as the British NLAWs, which are similar kind of, you know, man pod, you know, an individual holding the thing can take out a tank. And, you know, something that wasn't mentioned, and it's not directly relevant, but, you know, my heart goes out for those 3 young country bumpkins sitting in that tank that are driving into one of the cities. And you don't drive tanks into a city unless you have infantry protected. And 1 minute they're driving a tank, and the next minute they're toasted inside a fiery tank.
Well, the fact remains that Obama did stop building more nukes, so it's possible for this to happen.
Oh, it's possible. You know, I mean, you know, there was a big, you know, some of us, probably most of us, are old enough to remember the 1960s and the SANE movement, you know, to stop building nuclear warheads. And, you know, as Jerry pointed out, you know, if one country, you know, it might be a guy thing about size mattering, but we know enough nuclear warheads to take every major city in the world 10 to 12, 15 times. I think the Russians probably do it 30 times. How many nuclear warheads do you need to totally destroy the world? We have a lot more than we need, but there's money to be made there. And you know, and I mean, sort of when teaching, you know, whenever I ask the question about where your tax money goes, most of my students thought that most of the American taxes go to support, you know, lazy minorities. And when you show them the government tables, the government figures, you all see this on your 1040, 2/3 of our federal taxes go to support the military or groups allied to the military, like the Atomic Energy Commission that makes the bombs and all the intelligence agency. That's an awful lot of money pissed down the drain to take care of the military. But that's what happens when you have a powerful economic thing. And so some of us here are over 25 years old, and we know what the cost of medicine is. Thank Big Pharma. We can go on, but that would get us off the immediate topic.
You know, as important as the nuclear question is, I think there's sort of a deeper sort of problem for the left. I mean, I would assume that everybody's united opposing nuclear weapons, but the view of the left seems to be trapped sort of in the 1960s and out of the experience of the Vietnam War and perhaps after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the U.S. is the hegemonic and only really superpower in the world, and that nothing else can contest with it. And no recognition of a growing multi-centric world order. No recognition of the what globalization has meant in terms of economic ties and the ties of global assembly lines and financial ties throughout the world, ties of U.S. and China, Germany and Russia, and many, many more that has deeply affected the world. So thinking beyond, so confronted by this war, this Russian invasion, brings out this contradiction of sort of the left not being current, not having a current analysis of the global situation and not being able to change their thinking and just sort of being stuck in our older beliefs. It's not that the U.S. isn't dangerous. It's not that the U.S. doesn't have the most powerful military in the world. But there's other important, really important things that are going on that we need to recognize. And in fact, in terms of Russian imperialism, we should remember that World War I and World War II weren't started by the major imperialist powers. It was started by the imperialist power that needed to redivide the world. Germany was the secondary power in both those wars, and the only way to become a primary power was to upset the world order and to redivide the markets. So in that sense, the Putin and the Russian oligarchs and the military maybe, have a broader strategy here in terms of reordering the world. So they can be very, very dangerous, as well as U.S. imperialism. So I think that's sort of the broader sort of analytical problem that the left is facing, so to speak. The problem of how do we really view the world today, and all the threats to the people of the world. And I've been disappointed, quite frankly. I thought the idea of independence and self-determination was a pretty well-established socialist principle, really one of the most important, deeply rooted socialist principles ever since, the Bolsheviks and Lenin and others in the Comintern, way back in the 20s, really started to define it in Luxembourg and Bukharin and others were talking about the development of imperialism. And the fact that people don't seem to prioritize that as an understanding in today's world is sort of shocking from a left point of view, particularly because... Could
you restate that principle? I didn't hear it. It's not covered up.
Independence and self-determination.
Thank
you. I still can remember Ho Chi Minh. Nothing is more precious than independence and self-determination. And that was the left that, just looking at the age here of most of the participants, that's the left that we grew up in. That was the left that we cut our teeth on. And I would think that those principles would more strongly hold. So I think we have a responsibility to defend it and raise sort of this issue with our friends and comrades on the left, and bring the discussion forward.
Jerry, on the point you were making about hegemony, I think you had mentioned, and that wasn't the point of your presentation, but one of the major players right now is China. And China is being very clever at playing it both ways on its way toward turning Russia into a vassal state of itself, providing raw materials, oil, and some stuff to make computer chips and stuff like that, but as a subordinate power, allied with. And so, she is basically saying, oh, let's all have negotiations and let's not treat the Ukrainians the way we're treating the Uyghurs, et cetera, et cetera. But they are the ones who are really going to profit the most from it in terms of the decline of Russian power, which would have been taking place in any event, but that's a whole different question. The other thing, Gary, is, when you talk about the left is not a unanimous group. I mean, yes, I know, and we've had this discussion on the phone. I know a lot of lefties that I can't believe are supporting Putin, but that's not all the left. I know most of the people I hang out with, because they're coming more out of the humanist side, deplore this, just the invasion, the killing, the executions, those scenes. I can't even watch those little bits because I don't watch television. I get these little blurbs on my computer. But, that mass killing of civilians, that's taking place, that's completely unconscionable. And, and on the NATO thing, neither France nor Germany was about to let Ukraine in anyhow. The real issue, and there's another issue here, is that part of what seems to have set Putin off is the growing independence and democratization, which spells the end of autocratic governments, as we've seen many places. I don't want to go off on the tangent, but we see that these governments Orban was reelected, but look what happened in Chile and Peru.
On China, I have a somewhat of a different perspective. I think China is caught between a rock and a hard place right now.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably a lot of debate going on within the Chinese leadership about what's happening. Because I think, I do believe that, non-interference has been a principle for a long time. They haven't always followed it. They started a war with Vietnam and some other things. But in general, they have followed it over the decades of non-interference, and they are Ukraine's major trading partner. Obviously, they think they're looking for allies against the growing anti-China movements of the U.S. who have sought to, really constrict China's growth and have become very hostile to China over the last 5 years. But on the other hand, China is a great defender of globalization. In fact, they're probably the number one defender of globalization in the world today. And this is definitely fucking up globalization. I mean, this is really messing up lots of relationships that they depend on with the EU and, all around the world. And they certainly cannot be happy about that. So while they may be sitting back at one hand and looking at, well, the loser here, no matter what, it takes pressure off of us. It takes pressure off of U.S. looking at the Asian Pacific region. It also has all these negative aspects to what Chinese strategy and the Belt and Road and all their major focus is really about. So I think, like I said, I think there's probably a lot of debate going on in China, and they've been right. They have been sort of, trying to go right down the center on this, and I think that probably reflects the debates inside the party itself, which we're not going to get access to, obviously, but I think it's a reasonable assumption to think that some people in the party are happy with what's going on, others are very upset with what's going on, and they're trying to figure out how to move through the whole situation. So it's difficult for them.
Well, I'll tell you what I put into the chat. You said something, and probably other people agreed, that the central principle is, what did you say, independence, and what was the other?
Self-determination.
Yeah. You say, I say it can't be said that everybody thought that, because a long time ago, and I'm very old, I thought, I've always adhered to the great unity, that over time, our aim is for us all to be able to be taking care of us all, which I think extends the communist principles appropriately. I mean, the separation in between need not be the end goal, and it's a different mind thinking to have that in mind. I mean, people don't have an ability, on the whole, at least what we see manifest, people don't have the ability to talk about what we'd like to see here next door, let alone globally. And I say that what we'd like to have people be able to consider, that whole thing about it's people can more imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But I'd like people to imagine an ability to create us unified throughout the world as the objective of what we are trying to struggle for.
Cliff, I see you can hear us, right? Is this being recorded? Will it be up on a YouTube link?
I don't know. Good question. I kind of doubt that it's. Well, maybe the audio has been recorded, but I don't know about the video. Zoom is understanding what we are saying. I turned on the subscripts, and I'm getting a transcript as we speak. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Zoom has recorded it all, although I think it has. So we'll just have to see.
The one that says recording, if you look at the top of your screen, it seems to be recording.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But what is being recorded is the audio as well as the video. But we'll have to check that after we finish.
Okay.
I'm wondering, can I get pictures on a thumb drive? But not from here. I have them on, what do you call it, your thing.
Well, if the phone is connected into the computer, you can move them onto the thumb drive.
You think?
I think so.
Well, let's try that.
Where is really not as productive as I thought it was going to be. And I'm always disappointed.
Oh, the thumb drive.
It's already
Well, are there any other questions or comments people want to make, or are we drawing to a close on the discussion?
I want to say thank you. I appreciated what I was able to hear that you said. Seems like common sense to me. And relative to a great unity, I don't think we want a great unity imposed by a dictator from above. Rather, we want some sort of concord based on local self-determination, or so I imagine.
Did I give the impression that I was urging a dictator from above?
No.
I think it's very complex. I think it's very complex to establish what I'm talking about. And I do think that there are ways to have that go on without that kind of, without resorting to that method.
It wasn't clear to me from what you said.
Well, now you know.
Anything else from anybody, folks? People who haven't said nothing want to get in a word or two before we say goodbye?
Well, I'm sorry about the technical problems, but it was as a result of it. Many people joined late and missed the first part of your presentation, but hopefully we got most of it, and hopefully it has been recorded and saved. But thank you, Jerry, and I think that I should add that hopefully next week for our webinar we will not have this problem because we will be having a May Day observance, looking at Cuba's challenges as they exist today. Cuba will be resuming its giant May Day demonstrations on May 1st after a hiatus of 2 years due to the pandemic. So that's why we're checking in on Cuba next Monday, and hope you can be back with us for that. And hopefully things will go right technically. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Jerry, especially for hanging in there in the face of all of the obstacles.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Too bad, but next time will be better. Okay. Bye to everyone.
Roberto, are you still there? Can you hear me? I see Roberto's name on the screen, but his picture has vanished, so I guess he's hung up. Okay,